The second will be to adopt a purely moral posture, limiting ourselves to commentary. That path would condemn us to marginalization and powerlessness. Faced with the brutalization of the world, France and Europe must defend an effective multilateralism because it serves our interests and those of all who refuse to submit to the rule of force. And for me, the two answers are, on one side, more sovereignty and more autonomy for the Europeans, on the other side, an efficient multilateralism to deliver results through cooperation. Obviously, France and Europe are attached to national sovereignty and independence, to the United Nations and to its charter. And it's not an old-fashioned way to live multilateralism. It's just not to totally forget what we learned from the Second World War and remain committed to cooperation. And this is also because of those principles that we have decided to join the mutual exercise in Greenland without threatening anyone, but just supporting an ally and another European country, Denmark. Facing this order and this new situation, this year France holds the G7 presidency with a clear ambition to restore the G7 as a forum for frank dialogue among major economies and for collective and cooperative solutions. Trade wars, protectionist escalation, races towards overproduction will only produce losers. This is why addressing global economic imbalances is our key priority. And if we look at the situation, the current imbalances are due to some key phenomena, and we all have to deliver our own agenda. This includes American overconsumption, Chinese underconsumption and overinvestment, and European underinvestment and lack of competitiveness.
Welcome back to 45th Perspective. Today we're breaking down and reacting to a recent Senate hearing that has sparked a lot of debate about U.S. foreign policy, presidential power, and America's role in a world that's becoming more openly confrontational. The hearing centers on comments and actions linked to former President Donald Trump's renewed push for a more force-driven approach to global politics, including controversial rhetoric around U.S. influence over strategic territories like Greenland, and how that approach fits into America's alliances and long-term interests. Before we dive in, if you appreciate thoughtful, fact-driven analysis that doesn't just shout talking points, go ahead and like this video, subscribe to the channel, and help us grow this community. And if you want to support the work we do here more directly, you can become a patron at patreon.com/45thperspective. Every bit of support helps us keep these conversations going. Now, let's talk about the hearing itself. At its core, this Senate hearing was about accountability and direction. Senators questioned administration officials, foreign policy experts, and defense leaders on how the United States should conduct itself in an era where great power competition is no longer theoretical. Russia is at war in Europe, China is asserting itself economically and militarily, and long-standing alliances are being tested by nationalist politics at home and abroad. One side of the discussion leaned heavily on realism. The argument here is straightforward. The world is not a polite place, and pretending otherwise puts Americans at risk. Supporters of this view argue that power still matters, military strength still matters, and strategic positioning, whether in the Arctic, the Indo-Pacific, or Eastern Europe, is essential to protecting U.S. interests. From this perspective, Trump's blunt language, while uncomfortable, reflects a reality that America can't afford to ignore. Several senators pushed this point hard. They argued that adversaries don't respond to speeches about values alone. They respond to leverage. They respond to strength. They respond to clarity. In their view, ambiguity and excessive deference to multilateral institutions can signal weakness, especially when rivals are willing to use force or economic coercion to get what they want. Greenland, in this context, isn't about buying land. It's about Arctic access, rare earth minerals, shipping routes, and military positioning in a rapidly changing climate landscape. But the other side of the hearing pushed back strongly. Critics warned that leaning too heavily into a rule-of-force mindset risks unraveling decades of alliance building that has, for better or worse, helped prevent direct conflict between major powers. They argued that rhetoric matters, especially from U.S. leaders. When America appears willing to disregard sovereignty or treat allies as transactional assets, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty, historically, has been a breeding ground for conflict. These senators and witnesses emphasized that NATO, the United Nations, and other multilateral frameworks are not just feel-good talking shops. They are tools that amplify American influence by sharing costs, responsibilities, and legitimacy. When the U.S. acts alone, it bears the full burden, financially, militarily, and politically. When it acts with partners, it extends its reach without overextending itself. One particularly interesting exchange in the hearing focused on Europe's response. References were made to comments by leaders like France's President Emmanuel Macron, who has openly criticized militarism driven by force rather than cooperation. Macron's position, echoed by some witnesses, is that Europe must develop greater strategic autonomy not to oppose the U.S., but to avoid being dragged into conflicts shaped by unilateral decisions. That's a subtle but important point. Allies aren't rejecting America. They're hedging against unpredictability. Now, here's where things get complicated, and where I want to slow down a bit. Both sides of this argument have valid points. It is true that the international system is becoming more competitive and less forgiving. The post-Cold War assumption that economic integration would naturally lead to political stability has not played out the way many hoped. China's rise, Russia's aggression, and regional conflicts all point to a world where power politics are back in full force. Ignoring that reality would be naive. At the same time, history is full of examples where overconfidence in raw power led to costly mistakes. Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, these weren't failures because America lacked strength. They were failures of strategy, planning, and an overestimation of what force alone could accomplish. Senate Democrats, and even some Republicans in the hearing, repeatedly returned to this lesson. Strength without restraint can be just as dangerous as weakness. Another key theme that came up was the economic angle, which often gets overshadowed by the military talk. Witnesses pointed out that global power today isn't just about aircraft carriers and missiles. It's about supply chains, technology, energy, and investment. The U.S. faces serious internal challenges: aging infrastructure, political polarization, rising debt, that limit how much it can project power abroad without consequences at home. This is where the hearing became especially relevant for ordinary Americans. Foreign policy debates can feel abstract, but they have real-world impacts. Military spending affects taxes and social programs. Trade conflicts influence prices at the grocery store. Diplomatic breakdowns can lead to wars that cost lives and destabilize global markets. Several senators pressed witnesses on whether aggressive posturing actually makes Americans safer or simply increases the risk of escalation. One expert made a point that really stuck with me. They said that the most dangerous moments in history often come when leaders believe they have no constraints. Constraints, alliances, institutions, norms can be frustrating, but they also act as guardrails. They force debate. They slow down rash decisions. And sometimes, slowing down is exactly what prevents catastrophe. Still, supporters of Trump's approach would argue that those same constraints can paralyze action. They'd say that endless consultations and diplomatic caution allow adversaries to move faster and change facts on the ground. From that perspective, the Senate hearing itself could be seen as evidence of a system that talks too much and acts too slowly. So where does that leave us? My takeaway from this hearing is that the real issue isn't whether America should be strong or cooperative. It has to be both. The question is balance. Strength without diplomacy isolates. Diplomacy without strength invites challenge. The tension we saw in the hearing reflects a deeper struggle over how the U.S. defines leadership in the 21st century. For ordinary Americans, the stakes are high. A foreign policy that overreaches can drain resources and lives. A foreign policy that retreats too far can allow instability to spread, eventually reaching U.S. shores in the form of economic shocks or security threats. What voters should be paying attention to is not just the slogans, but the strategies behind them. The Senate hearing didn't give us easy answers, but it did something important. It forced these disagreements into the open. And that's healthy for a democracy. Discomfort is often a sign that real questions are being asked. As we move closer to another election cycle, expect these debates to intensify. Foreign policy will be framed as strength versus weakness, patriotism versus globalism, realism versus idealism. The truth, as usual, sits somewhere in between. And it's up to citizens to look past the noise and demand policies that are tough, smart, and sustainable. That's my perspective, but I want to hear yours. Do you think the U.S. needs to take a harder line in today's world, even if it strains alliances? Or do you believe cooperation and multilateralism remain America's greatest strengths? Drop your thoughts in the comments, keep the discussion respectful, and let's actually try to understand each other. If you found this analysis helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. And again, if you want to support the channel, check out patreon.com/45thperspective. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.